everyone, and welcome again to the Philly Factor. And we are honored to have on this edition of our program the author of a new book, Lieutenant Colonel Alan Davies, United States Marine Corps. Dr. Davies served in the Vietnam War, and he has written a book, The Backside of the Firefight, A Surgeon's Shop Notes from Vietnam. And we welcome Dr. Alan Davies to our program. Dr. Davies, thank you so much for being with us here on the Philly Factor.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
First of all, right from the get-go, thank you for your service. You served in a war that was not very popular while it was going on, and I believe the Vietnam veterans are just now getting their due, rightfully so, for all of their efforts in the Vietnam War. So we owe a tremendous debt of gratitude to you and all of the guys that served in the Vietnam War that came home, and the 50,000 plus that did not come home. And so we thank you very much for your service, as well as their sacrifices during that war. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
The Backside of the Firefight, A Surgeon's Shop Notes from Vietnam. You have detailed in this book that I'm so fortunate to have with me in more than, I'm going to say there are at least 30 chapters in here, but when we think of chapters, we think of chapter upon chapter of chapter. There's 32 different chapters in the book, but they are small, concise chapters that really get into what it was that you, as a cardiothoracic surgeon, went through prior to being dispatched to Vietnam, and once you hit the ground. So I don't want to make people feel that this is a book like War and Peace that's going to take forever to read. It is very concise, right to the point, and you recall vividly all of these incidents, the experiences that you and your fellow military men and women experienced on the ground in Vietnam. But I have to ask, how does a cardiothoracic surgeon from Pennsylvania wind up in the battlefields of Vietnam?
Well, it's a little story about I was born up in Avoca, Pennsylvania, up in northeastern part of the state, and went to grade school there during the Second World War. I remember Franklin Delano Roosevelt speaking the day Pearl Harbor was hit and talking about the day that will live in infamy. That's one of the first things I remember. I was about 6 years old, and I lived through the Second World War, and there were many, many Gold Star families up in Luzerne County, Avoca. I went to high school at Wyoming Seminary in Kingston, did a lot of studying and preparation and a little wrestling, and wound up going to Penn State and doing a lot of chemical engineering and a little wrestling, and then wound up at Jefferson Medical School, which was a wonderful experience. With some of the best surgeons in the world at that time. I interned down in Texas with Dr. Michael DeBakey, a world-renowned surgeon at that time. Came back to Jefferson for my general surgery, and in 1966 graduated my surgical residency and went down to 401 North Broad Street and got my examination and was signed into the United States Army. They told me in 1966 that they really didn't need any thoracic surgeons right then, that I could go ahead and take another year or so of training. And I did so at the Mass General in Boston, fairly well-known hospital. And then another year over in England with two renowned thoracic surgeons, Dr. Sir Ronald Belsey and Sir Jack Griffith. About a month after I finished there, I was in Fort Sam for what was supposed to be a 6 to 8 week orientation. It lasted about 10 days, and I wound up in Da Nang and then a place called Chulai. Uh, so that's how I sort of got there. Uh,
You recount. Um, um, I want to go back to the listening to FDR back on December 7th, 1941. It's a day that it still reminds us of what happened and how the United States got involved in World War II. When I mean, as a 6 year old, ironically, as a 6 year old, I remember the day that JFK was shot because it happened to be on my birthday. So these events stay with us for forever. So was that experience sitting in your family's car listening to FDR? It was that the how did that influence you to decide that not only would you go and pursue a medical career, but that when Uncle Sam called, that I guess you really had no choice back then in the '60s because most guys coming out of high school or coming out of college were automatically drafted, were they not?
yes, they were, Paul. But you're absolutely correct about the effect that those words from FDR had on me as a 6 year old. That planted the seeds of patriotism that went through my entire life. Um, as a young boy, I went around with wooden guns shooting Germans and Japs. And uh, when I was 15 years old, I uh, went to Indian Town Gap with the 109th Infantry and spent 2 weeks with the infantry there, learned how to drive a tank and fix the tank treads. And I actually had another 2 years of ROTC up at Penn State. So during my entire um, pre-Vietnam experience, patriotism was just part of my life. I love my country, and so when I was drafted, and when I went to Vietnam, it wasn't that I was wrestled away from my family. Um, I felt as though this was something that was part of what I should do, and it was automatic that I go. Um, I went with a sense of pride and a, uh, and a real responsibility to do what I could do.
Did all of the training, and I think I already know the answer to this question, but all of the training that you went through here stateside, and then you're dispatched to go to Vietnam. I suspect that all that training was important, but I don't know if it necessarily prepares you or anyone else. Maybe it's changed a little bit today, but um, when you hit the ground in Vietnam, all of that training, did it prepare you for what you actually would eventually have to see and do in Vietnam?
Paul, that's a very interesting question. I was trained by the best in the world at that time. Um, and my generation of surgeons grew up in the 60s and in the largest cities, San Francisco and New York, Boston, New Orleans, where there was a lot of trauma, there was a lot of crime, there were a lot of gunshot wounds, and we were prepared to handle a lot of that trauma. Uh, the thing that made it different, Paul, was that it came all at once and never stopped. Um, when you were civilian trauma would happen maybe once every 3 or 4 days, but in Vietnam it happened every day, um, and it was multiple cases every day, and it was wounds that we really never did see, but we always had the basic principles of uh, to fall back on.
Mhm.
It was the first war that several things were different. One was we were able to use vein grafts to put together arteries that were severed,
Mhm.
and this saved hundreds of arms and legs that would have been amputated in prior wars. We also had a different grasp of how to treat thoracic injuries. Um, they during the Korean and early Vietnam phase, everybody got operated on, had their chests open, and the mortality rate was very high for the chest wounds. My generation of surgeons, with our training and experience, were able to determine that very few of those cases had to be opened, and we could handle them with chest tubes, drainage of blood, and transfusions, and maybe 1 out of 10 would have to undergo operative intervention. This cut the mortality rate in chest wounds from about 80% to almost almost zero.
Mhm.
So there were a lot of things that we were armed with when we went to Vietnam that surgeons in prior wars did not have.
I I am amazed at the amount of details that you share in your book. And I mean, I would think that given the experiences that you and your fellow surgeons and soldiers and the military went through, that you recount all of these stories with such vivid details. Why did you decide that you wanted to write this book? Why was it important for you to write this book?
Well, I thought about that quite a bit, and I wanted to write it for my family for one reason, and I wanted to write it for all of the doctors and nurses and fighting men who were in Vietnam. We were muzzled when we came home. We were unable to talk about our experiences. Nobody wanted to listen. People withdrew from us like they would Attila the Hun's boys and Confederate soldiers. Um, we were ostracized in many cases. And as you know in the book, that when I started my private practice, I wasn't allowed to take care of civilian injuries uh, because I didn't have any experience with civilian injuries. This was just a way to keep out uh, a lot of the boys that came back from being able to start their lives back up again.
Mm.
Um, so I must say that I wrote the book uh, for all the people that participated in that war in an effort to show what it was like in the war and to speak out about what happened when we came home.
Was it difficult for you to write this book? Now, I know you said that you wanted to write it primarily for your family, and look, there's no doubt about it. A lot of guys came back and they were not only damaged physically but also mentally. But um, did you find yourself wrestling with? I mean, given everything you just told us about how society pretty much ostracized all of the Vietnam veterans that were coming back, but did you felt this need that you needed to write it for your family, but when you actually sat down and decided to write this book, was it difficult for you to recall all of these memories that occurred to you and your fellow soldiers, Marine Corps members, doctors that were out there in the field? Was it difficult?
No, it really wasn't. Once I started, um, it was amazing how the book opened up to me, and I really recall many things that I had buried for quite some time, 55 years or so. Uh, so it really wasn't difficult once I got started, but it took me 55 years to get started. That can answer your question.
Yeah.
But
Uh, I think a lot of people would agree that the hardest part is getting started. And then once it's started, everything just starts to flow for you.
yes, it was amazing how many of those stories I had told of my close friends during my life, and I'd get somebody would say, "Hey, Al, you ought to write a book," and I say, "Ah, yeah, sure." Well, I wrote about 45 articles in the surgical literature, so I wasn't really a neophyte as far as writing was concerned, but I didn't think it really was going to be applicable uh, until just recently with the turmoil that we've had in uh, our country, and I just thought it was time to maybe put that out there and maybe put some things in perspective,
Sure.
Paul.
Well, now I suspect that when you were writing some of these articles, for these medical journals, that helped with I guess, the process of writing the book. But were you taking notes or journaling or keeping um, a notepad? I mean, here you are, you're in a war zone and you're being pressed into service. But did you find yourself um, taking notes or scribbling down things on pieces of paper that you stuck in your pocket and you found years later, and that's what helped you in your journey to write this book?
I never did, but I wish that I had. Uh, I really wish that I had because there were many things that probably are lost. And I could really say that I could probably have written another book about the things I didn't put in the first book.
Mm-hmm.
There are things you just can't get down on paper, but I never did. Uh, I relived many of those episodes many times
I'm
during
sure.
my my post-Vietnam life because I spent the rest of my life in the operating room also. That was where I spent more time in the operating room than I did sleeping in
Sure.
the 40 years after Vietnam or so.
Given everything that you went through, and we have heard, and I think this is I don't want to say it's a relatively new term or diagnosis, but we have heard a lot over the past maybe 10 or 20 years about PTSD, uh, post traumatic stress. Um, how, I mean, it probably was maybe it was diagnosed back then, and these people coming back were suffering from everything that they had seen and experienced themselves. But how did you manage to avoid that? I mean, you get so caught up in the task at hand that you insulate or isolate yourself from everything that you're seeing on the battlefield or in those, field hospitals. I mean, how did you avoid that?
Well, Paul, I think you're referring to the Second World War when the boys came back. They used to say they were shell shocked.
Right.
That was the terminology that was used at that time.
Hmm.
I really was very interested in the situation that I really never showed signs of PTSD. And as I went through the book, I used to I was always I always thought that there was something that was protecting me from it. And I did quite a bit of research in the psychological realm and consulted with Dr. Savicki um, and there are certain uh, situations or that make you more susceptible to PTSD. Um, the younger people, uh, women more likely, lesser educated folks. Uh, They're someone who has had prior problems with drugs and alcohol. Um, so there are some predetermining uh, factors, but there are five factors, Paul, that have been shown and fairly well proven as protectors. And the first thing is the ability to have proficiency in your job.
Mhm.
Well, I had that in spades. I had been trained by the best in the world, and I hit there as a young man who was ready to go. Um, the uh, and that protected me against doubt and uh, oh boy, I can't do this or whatever.
Mhm.
Number two is to have a purpose. And I certainly did have a purpose, which was to try to take care of everybody and not let anybody die.
Mhm.
And the third factor is having faith. And I certainly did have faith that I was there, but there was somebody that was helping me.
Mhm.
Uh, the fourth thing was patriotism. And as we talked in the beginning of the interview, I had patriotism from the day I was a young boy,
Sure.
and when I was in Vietnam, I felt as though it was a privilege to be there, and I listened to some of my buddies, and it was like, gee, they were saying, oh, I wish I could get out of here and this, that, and the next thing. And I was thinking, I'm not that guy. I'm not thinking that way. I'm thinking that this is a chance to pay back and uh, take care of my brothers. And the last thing is esprit de corps. And I think all the soldiers of the world have sort of felt that. And I certainly felt that in our surgical hospitals in Vietnam. We all pulled together so hard. The nurses, for one solid year, would work 12-hour shifts, 12 on and 12 off for 1 year.
Mhm.
Uh, we worked we worked first, second, and third call during the TET during TET in 1970 or 1968. I worked steadily for 73 hours
Wow.
without any rest. So um, those factors, those five factors, really protected me from PTSD, and the Lord was with me.
Sure. We're short on time here, but I have to ask you about the Phillies baseball cap and what it meant in the hospital in Vietnam.
Well, the Phillies baseball cap. This came from Captain Eileen Logan, who was from South Philly.
Mhm.
Uh, when the chopper would come in with they'd come in with 15 or 20 mortally wounded soldiers. There were five surgeons around, and there were maybe 10 or so nurses. That could be a chaotic situation.
Sure.
Uh, who will I take care of? What'll I do? So we decided we needed a chief of triage who would have the whole room under his control. And we all looked the same, and we were all sort of skinny little boys and girls with our fatigues on. So we got the Phillies hat, and whoever wore the Phillies hat, he was in charge. And he would say, Davies, you take this guy and you take care of him, and Walsh, you take this guy, and you never talk back to the guy with the red hat because you're going to have to wear the red hat tomorrow.
Right. Right.
So this is how we designated who was going to get taken care of, who was so mortally injured that they could never be fixed. And there were a lot of big, tough decisions that had to be made by the head under the Phillies hat.
Well,
So that's why I'm wearing it.
we just have about 2 minutes left here in the program. I want to mention here that all proceeds from the sale of your book will go to Canines Assisting Service Heroes of Dover, Delaware. And where can people pick up a copy of your book, Dr. Davies?
Well, it's available on Amazon, uh, and it's $10, and all profits are going to go to training those service dogs uh, that we give out 3 or 4 a year. It takes a year and about $20,000 to train one dog, but they go to guys with severe PTSD and vets who maybe have lost a spouse and need the help, and guys who have had amputations, etc. Great program. The dogs are all rescue dogs, and they're rescuing a bunch of good people.
Again, the name of the book is The Backside of the Firefight, A Surgeon's Shop Notes from Vietnam. Again, the book is available. I have to say it's a bargain, but people will find themselves fully immersed in what you and your colleagues went through in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. Dr. Davies is a retired cardiothoracic surgeon. He resides in Earlville, Maryland, on a hay farm on the Chesapeake Bay, and he enjoys golf, sailing, writing, and storytelling. This is his first book, and I suspect it may be your first book, but I could tell there's probably another book or two or three in you, Dr. Davies, and I hope to have you back on again and talk about those books, and as well as your continued work, as well as promoting this book. It's such an important book for people to read and to understand exactly what it was that you and so many other people went through there, and your contributions to the United States. And again, as I said at the beginning of the program, I thank you for your contributions, and I wish you well with this book, The Backside of the Firefight, A Surgeon's Shop Notes from Vietnam. Dr. Davies, thank you so much for being with us here on the Philly Factor.
Thank you very much, Paul. Appreciate your interest.
Thank you very much. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us here on the Philly Factor. Until next time, have a great day. Enjoy this nice weather that we're experiencing right now. We'll see you next time on the Philly Factor here on LaSalle TV.